The thundering sound of hooves echoed through Eagle Canyon as Willa Armstrong raced against the setting sun, her chestnut mare stretching into a full gallop. The year was 1878, and the California gold rush that had transformed these lands decades earlier had left behind a patchwork of struggling towns and determined settlers. Willa, 24 and fiercely independent, had little patience for the constraints society placed on women of her station. She'd rather feel the wind in her hair and dirt beneath her horse's hooves than attend another suffocating social gathering in San Andreas. "Come on, Penny," she urged as the canyon walls rose higher around them. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the rocky terrain, turning the red sandstone into rivers of fire. Willa knew she should turn back. Her father would be furious if she returned after dark, but something in the wildness of this place called to her soul. The path narrowed dangerously, hugging the canyon wall with a steep drop to her right. Penny's ears flicked nervously as loose stones skittered beneath her hooves. Willa patted the mare's neck, attempting to convey confidence she was beginning to lose herself. "Easy, girl. We'll turn back at the next bend," she promised. But fate had other plans. A rattlesnake, coiled in warning, appeared suddenly on the path. Penny reared in terror, her forelegs pawing at the air. Willa clutched desperately at the reins, trying to control the panicked animal, but the mare's back hooves slipped over the edge. Time seemed to slow as Willa felt herself sliding from the saddle, her body twisting in mid-air before striking the rocky slope. She tumbled downward, pain exploding through her limbs as she clawed frantically for purchase. Her descent ended in a bone-jarring impact that drove the breath from her lungs. Above, she could hear Penny's terrified neighing as the horse regained the path and bolted back the way they had come. Willa lay stunned, taking inventory of her body. Her right ankle throbbed with white-hot intensity, and blood trickled from scrapes on her arms and face, but miraculously, nothing seemed broken except perhaps her pride. The reality of her situation dawned slowly. She was trapped on a narrow ledge at least 30 feet below the trail, with the canyon floor another 60 feet beneath her. The walls were too steep to climb, especially with an injured ankle, and as the sun continued its descent, the temperature would drop rapidly in the desert night. "Help!" she called, her voice bouncing between the canyon walls. "Anybody, help me!" Only the mocking echo of her own voice answered. Tears of frustration welled in her eyes as she realized the foolishness of her adventure. No one knew where she was. Her father wouldn't start worrying until after dark, and even then, how would anyone find her in this vast wilderness? As the shadows lengthened, Willa fought against despair. She tore strips from her petticoat to bind her swollen ankle and huddled against the rock face for what little protection it offered from the evening chill. The stars emerged, brilliant and indifferent to her plight. "I refuse to die here," she whispered to herself, even as exhaustion pulled at her consciousness. Morning light brought renewed hope and a full understanding of her predicament. The ledge she occupied was barely 5 feet wide, littered with loose stones and sparse, stubborn vegetation clinging to cracks in the rock. Water trickled from somewhere above, forming a small puddle that she gratefully scooped into her parched mouth. She was contemplating another attempt to call for help when she heard the distant sound of hooves. Scrambling to her knees, mindful of her tender ankle, Willa shouted with all the strength she could muster. "Down here. Please, I'm down here." The hoofbeats paused, then approached cautiously. A shadow fell across the canyon rim, and Willa looked up to see a man peering down at her. The sun silhouetted him, making details impossible to distinguish. "Hold on, madam," a deep voice called. "I'm coming down to get you." Relief flooded through her. quickly followed by embarrassment at being found in such a state, dress torn, hair wild, face streaked with dirt and dried blood. But pride seemed a foolish luxury when survival hung in the balance. The stranger disappeared from view, only to reappear moments later with a coiled rope slung over his shoulder. With swift, confident movements, he secured one end to his saddle horn and began his descent, finding footholds where Willa had seen only sheer rock. As he approached, she could make out more details. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt. His hat, pushed back on his head, revealed a strong face weathered by sun and wind. Not handsome in the conventional sense that San Andreas society valued, but compelling in its rugged character. Jacob Riley, he introduced himself as he reached her ledge, his boots sending small stones cascading into the depths below. "Folks call me Jake." "Willa Armstrong," she replied, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance. My horse was startled by a snake." He nodded, eyes quickly assessing her condition. "You're lucky to be alive, Miss Armstrong. That's quite a fall you took." His gaze lingered on her bound ankle. "Can you put any weight on that?" She attempted to stand and winced. "A little." "Well, a little won't get you up this cliff. I'll have to carry you." He turned and crouched before her. "Put your arms around my neck." Willa hesitated, acutely aware of the impropriety of such close contact with a stranger. But the alternative was remaining stranded on this ledge, and she had no desire to test how long she might survive. "I promise to be a gentleman," Jake said with a hint of amusement in his voice, correctly interpreting her reluctance. Swallowing her pride, Willa wrapped her arms around his neck. In one smooth motion, he stood and hoisted her onto his back. She could feel the solid strength of him, the warmth of his body contrasting with the cool morning air. "Hold tight," he instructed, and began the ascent. The climb was treacherous. Several times, loose rock gave way beneath Jake's boots, leaving them momentarily suspended by his grip on the rope. Willa clung to him, face pressed against his shoulder, trying not to think about the drop beneath them. Despite her weight, he moved with the surety of someone who knew this terrain intimately, finding hand and footholds where she would have seen none. When they finally reached the rim, Jake carefully set her down before pulling himself over the edge. Willa had never been so grateful to feel solid ground beneath her. His horse, a magnificent black stallion, stood patiently nearby. "Thank you," she said, the words wholly inadequate for what he'd done. "You saved my life." Jake adjusted his hat, studying her with eyes the color of summer sage. "You're a long way from town, Miss Armstrong. Not many folks venture this deep into Eagle Canyon alone." "I wasn't planning to come this far," she admitted. "And please call me Willa." A slight smile curved his lips. "Well, Willa, we should get you home before that ankle swells anymore. Your family must be worried sick." The thought of her father's reaction made her wince more than her injury. Thomas Armstrong was protective to the point of suffocation since her mother's death 5 years ago. This incident would only reinforce his belief that she needed constant supervision. "My horse ran off," she said, looking down the trail. "She'll probably head back to our ranch." Jake whistled, and his stallion approached. "Midnight here is strong enough for 2. I'll take you back to San Andreas." He helped her mount, then swung up behind her with effortless grace. The proximity was startlingly intimate, his chest against her back, one arm around her waist to steady her. Willa felt her cheeks flush and was grateful he couldn't see her face. "Your father wouldn't happen to be Thomas Armstrong, owner of the Silver Dollar Bank?" Jake asked as they set off at a gentle pace. "Yes," she replied, surprised. "Do you know him?" There was a pause before he answered. "We've crossed paths. I do some cattle driving for the ranches around these parts. Banking business comes up." Something in his tone suggested there was more to the story, but Willa was too exhausted to press for details. The rhythmic motion of the horse beneath them and the warmth of Jake's body behind her had a soporific effect. Despite her best efforts, her head nodded as fatigue overtook her. "Rest," Jake's voice rumbled close to her ear. "I've got you." And for the first time in years, Willa allowed herself to lean on someone else's strength, drifting into sleep as they made their way out of the canyon. She awakened as they approached the outskirts of San Andreas. The town had grown substantially since its early days as a mining camp, boasting several brick buildings along the main street, including her father's bank. But it retained the rough edges of its frontier origins, with saloons outnumbering churches and dust that never seemed to settle completely. "Where's your home?" Jake asked, his voice startling her from her observations. "The White House on the hill," she replied, pointing to the Armstrong residence that overlooked the town. Her father had built it as a symbol of his success and a tribute to her mother, who had dreamed of living in such a grand place but died before its completion. Jake's grip on the reins tightened imperceptibly. "Fancy place." "It's just a house," Willa said, feeling suddenly defensive though she wasn't sure why. They rode in silence through the town, drawing curious glances from townsfolk unaccustomed to seeing Thomas Armstrong's daughter in such a state, much less riding double with an unfamiliar cowboy. Willa lifted her chin, ignoring the whispers that would undoubtedly spread like wildfire. As they approached the Armstrong estate, the front door flew open, and Thomas Armstrong himself rushed out, followed by Franklin Davis, the town sheriff. Her father's relief at seeing her quickly transformed into thunderous anger when he took in her appearance and companion. "Willa, where have you been? We've had search parties out all night." His gaze shifted to Jake, suspicion hardening his features. "Riley, what are you doing with my daughter?" Jake dismounted smoothly and reached up to help Willa down. "Your daughter had an accident in Eagle Canyon, Mr. Armstrong. Her horse threw her over a cliff edge. I happened to be passing by and heard her calls for help." Sheriff Davis stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his holstered pistol. "That's so, Riley. Mighty convenient you being out in those parts." Willa felt Jake stiffen beside her. There was clearly history here that she wasn't privy to. "He saved my life," she interjected firmly. "I would still be trapped on that ledge if not for Mr. Riley." Her father's expression softened slightly as he took in her injured ankle and the dried blood on her face. "Come inside, Willa. You need a doctor." "Not before I properly thank Mr. Riley," she insisted. Thomas Armstrong reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a money clip. "How much do I owe you for returning my daughter, Riley?" Jake's face darkened. "I didn't do it for money, Armstrong." "Nevertheless, I pay my debts." He extended several bills. "Father," Willa exclaimed, mortified. "Mr. Riley risked his life climbing down that cliff to save me. He deserves our gratitude, not payment like some hired hand." The tension between the two men was palpable. Finally, Jake touched the brim of his hat. "No payment necessary, Mr. Armstrong. Good day to you, Miss Willa. Take care of that ankle." He mounted Midnight in one fluid motion and turned the horse away. "Wait," Willa called after him. "Will I see you again?" Jake looked back, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. "This is a small town, Miss Armstrong. I reckon our paths might cross." With that, he rode away, leaving Willa with more questions than answers. Her father ushered her inside, his lecture on proper behavior for a young lady washing over her like background noise. But Willa's thoughts remained with the mysterious cowboy who had pulled her from the canyon and the obvious animosity between him and her father. Dr. Simmons was summoned and pronounced her ankle badly sprained but not broken. With proper rest and care, she would recover fully within a few weeks. Willa endured his fussing and her father's hovering with as much patience as she could muster, but her mind kept returning to Jake Riley. "Who is he, father?" she finally asked when they were alone in the parlor, her ankle propped on a cushioned stool. "Mr. Riley, I mean. You obviously know him." Thomas Armstrong's face clouded. "He's nothing for you to concern yourself with, Willa. A drifter, a troublemaker. His father was a rustler who died in a shootout with the law. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree." "He saved my life," she reminded him. "And I'm grateful for that," her father conceded. "But that doesn't make him suitable company for my daughter. San Andreas may be a frontier town, but we still maintain certain standards." Willa bit back a retort. She knew from experience that arguing would only entrench her father's position further. Better to bide her time and find answers on her own. Over the next few days, Willa recovered under the watchful eyes of her father and Mrs. Tillman, their housekeeper. Penny had indeed returned to the ranch, as Jake had predicted, which had prompted the search parties. Visitors came to inquire about her health, and not incidentally, to gather first-hand accounts of her adventure to share at social gatherings. Through careful questioning of these visitors, particularly Martha Wilson, the wife of the general store owner and San Andreas' most reliable source of gossip, Willa learned more about Jake Riley. "Oh, my dear, that man has quite a history in these parts," Martha confided, leaning forward in her chair. "His father, Robert Riley, was indeed hanged for cattle rustling about 15 years back, when Jake was just a boy. The poor child witnessed the whole thing. Afterward, the Whitaker family, good Christian folks who ran the livery stable, took him in." "They raised him?" Willa asked, passing Martha another slice of apple cake. Martha nodded, accepting the cake gratefully. "Until he was 16 or so. Then he left to make his own way. Worked as a ranch hand, scout, even rode with the Pony Express for a spell. He's got a small spread north of town now, runs a few cattle of his own, keeps to himself mostly. And my father, why does he dislike Mr. Riley so intensely?" Martha hesitated, clearly weighing the propriety of sharing such information against the delight of having an eager audience. Delight won out. "Well, there was that business with your father's bank about 5 years ago. Jake had just purchased his land, and then suddenly the bank called in the loan. Nearly lost everything. He managed to scrape together the money somehow, some say by less than legal means, though nothing was ever proven." "Why would father do that?" Willa wondered aloud. "Your father has always been cautious about who he does business with." "The Riley name carries certain associations in San Andreas." Martha patted Willa's hand. "But I've said enough. Your father wouldn't approve of such talk." No, he wouldn't, Willa thought, but her curiosity about Jake Riley had only grown stronger. As soon as she was able to move about with just a walking stick for support, Willa determined to find Jake and thank him properly. Her opportunity came when her father was called away to Sacramento on banking business, leaving her in Mrs. Tillman's care. The housekeeper was easily convinced that a short carriage ride into town for fresh air would aid Willa's recovery. Once in town, Willa directed their driver, Emmett, to the livery stable. If anyone knew where to find Jake, it would be the Whitakers who had raised him. The livery was a large, well-maintained wooden structure at the edge of town. The smell of hay and horses filled the air as Willa limped inside, grateful for the relative coolness of the shadowy interior after the bright September sunshine. A man in his 60s looked up from where he was mending a saddle. "Miss Armstrong," he said, clearly surprised. "What brings you to my humble establishment, Mr. Whitaker?" she greeted him. "I'm looking for Jake Riley. You know where I might find him?" The old man's weathered face revealed nothing, "Might I ask why you're looking for Jake?" "I wish to thank him properly for rescuing me," she said. "My father was not as gracious as he should have been." Caleb Whitaker studied her for a long moment. "Jake's got his own place now. North Ridge Ranch, about 5 miles north of town. Follow the creek past the old mission ruins." He hesitated. "But I'm not sure it's proper for a young lady like yourself to be calling on a bachelor, Miss Armstrong, especially not with your father being who he is." "I'll have Emmett with me," Willa assured him. "And propriety seems a small concern when compared to properly thanking someone who saved my life." A hint of approval flickered in the old man's eyes. "Jake's a good man, despite what some in this town might say. His father made his choices, but Jake's always walked an honest path, no matter how hard that road's been." "I believe you," Willa said, and realized she meant it. Something about Jake Riley had struck her as fundamentally honorable, despite her father's warnings. Whitaker gave her more detailed directions, and Willa returned to the carriage. Emmett looked dubious about their destination but didn't argue. As they drove north out of town, the landscape opened up into rolling hills dotted with oak trees and the occasional stand of pine. The creek Whitaker had mentioned sparkled in the sunlight, leading them like a silver thread through the countryside. The ruins of the old Spanish mission appeared on their left, crumbling adobe walls partially reclaimed by nature. Just beyond, a modest ranch house came into view, set against a backdrop of rugged hills. A corral nearby held several horses, and a small herd of cattle grazed in the distance. As they approached, Willa saw Jake emerge from a barn, a pitchfork in hand. He stopped when he spotted the carriage, setting the tool aside and walking toward them with long, measured strides. "Miss Armstrong," he called as Emmett brought the carriage to a halt. "This is an unexpected visit." Willa noticed how his eyes quickly scanned the surrounding area as though checking if she had been followed. "I wanted to thank you properly," she explained as Emmett helped her down, "and to apologize for my father's behavior." Jake's expression softened slightly. "No need for either." "How's the ankle?" "Improving daily," she said, demonstrating by taking a few steps with her walking stick. "Dr. Simmons says I was fortunate." An awkward silence fell between them. Willa hadn't planned beyond this moment, hadn't considered what she would say once she was actually standing before him. Up close, in the full light of day, she could better appreciate the strong lines of his face, the intelligence in his green eyes, the way his dark hair curled slightly where it met his collar. "Would you like to come inside?" he offered, gesturing toward the ranch house. "It's not much, but I could offer you some coffee, or I might have some tea somewhere." Emmett cleared his throat pointedly. "Miss Willa, your father would want me to properly thank Mr. Riley," she finished firmly. "We won't be long, Emmett." The driver looked unhappy, but retreated to the carriage. Jake led Willa toward the house, slowing his pace to accommodate her injury. The interior of the ranch house was simple but tidy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, with a worn but clean sofa and chairs arranged before it. A bookshelf in the corner held a surprising number of volumes, and a desk beneath the window was covered with papers that looked like ranch accounts. "Please sit," Jake said, pulling out a chair at the small dining table. "I'll put on that coffee." Willa watched as he moved around the kitchen area with easy familiarity, stoking the stove and preparing the coffee pot. Despite his size and strength, there was a gentleness to his movements, a care that belied the rough exterior. "You have a lovely home," she said, meaning it. Jake glanced at her as if checking for sarcasm, then nodded. "It's not much compared to your father's place, but it's mine. Every board and nail of it. You built it yourself, most of it." He set 2 cups on the table and leaned against the counter while waiting for the coffee to brew. Took me 3 years to save enough for this land, and another 2 to build something more substantial than a lean-to. Mr. Whitaker at the livery told me you've worked hard for everything you have. A shadow crossed Jake's face. Caleb and Martha were good to me when no one else would take in a rustler's son. I owe them more than I can ever repay. The coffee pot began to bubble, and Jake busied himself pouring 2 cups. He set one before Willa and took the seat opposite her. "Mr. Riley, Jake, I want to know why my father dislikes you so much," Willa said, deciding directness was the best approach. Martha Wilson mentioned something about a loan. Jake's expression hardened. "Your father doesn't approve of me trying to rise above my station. When I first bought this land, he was willing enough to extend credit. But then he heard I was courting Elizabeth Harrington, the daughter of Judge Harrington. Suddenly, my loan was called in full, due immediately." "That's terrible," Willa said, genuinely appalled. "Did you and Miss Harrington?" "No," Jake said shortly. "Once her father heard about the loan situation, he forbade her from seeing me. Elizabeth wasn't strong-willed enough to defy him." He took a sip of his coffee. "In the end, it was for the best. I needed someone who would stand by me through the hard times, not flee at the first sign of trouble." Willa found herself wondering what kind of woman would be worthy of this man's loyalty. Someone brave, certainly. Someone who valued character over social standing. "How did you manage to keep your land?" she asked. A slight smile curved his lips. "I sold everything else I owned, worked double shifts at 3 different ranches, lived on beans and coffee for months, but I kept it." Admiration filled her. In San Andreas society, a man like Jake Riley was considered beneath notice, a nobody with a tainted family name. Yet he had shown more determination and integrity than many of the so-called respectable businessmen her father associated with. "I'm sorry my father treated you that way," she said softly. Jake studied her over the rim of his cup. "You're not like him." "No," Willa agreed. "I'm not. Father believes a woman's place is to be decorative and obedient, to marry well and enhance the family's social standing. That's why he was so furious about my ride into Eagle Canyon. It wasn't concern for my safety as much as fear that I'd damage my reputation." "And what do you believe your place is?" Jake asked, his gaze steady. The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked what she wanted. It was simply assumed she would follow the path laid out for her. Marriage to someone of suitable background and wealth, children, a life of social obligations and charitable works. "I want to determine my own fate," she said finally. "To be judged for who I am, not who my father is or how much money we have. I want—" She hesitated, then continued with growing conviction. "I want to marry for love, not advantage, to build a life with someone who sees me as a partner, not a possession." Jake's expression softened, something warm kindling in his eyes. "Those are dangerous ideas in a town like San Andreas." "Perhaps," she acknowledged with a small smile, "but I nearly died in that canyon. It makes one reconsider what truly matters." Their conversation flowed easily after that. Jake told her about his ranch, his dreams of expanding his herd, the horses he was training. Willa shared her love of books, her secret desire to travel beyond California's borders, her frustration with the limitations placed on women. Time slipped away unnoticed until Emmett appeared at the door, pointedly mentioning that Mrs. Tillman would be expecting them back soon. Jake walked Willa to the carriage. "Thank you for coming," he said, helping her up the step. "It was unexpected. Will I see you again?" She asked, echoing her question from the day he'd rescued her. This time his answer was different. "I'd like that, Willa, but your father is in Sacramento for another week," she finished. "I ride in the meadow near Twin Pines every morning when my ankle is better, of course." A slow smile spread across his face. "I might have business in that direction myself, once your ankle is better." The drive back to town seemed to take half the time of the journey out. Willa's mind was filled with Jake, his voice, his smile, the way he looked at her as if truly seeing her. For the first time, she understood the romantic heroines in her novels who risked everything for love. Not that she was in love, she quickly corrected herself. She barely knew Jake Riley, but she wanted to know more, to discover if the connection she felt was merely gratitude or something deeper. Over the next 2 weeks, Willa's ankle healed steadily. True to her word, she began riding in the meadow near Twin Pines once Dr. Simmons gave his approval. On the 3rd morning, Jake appeared on midnight, his expression brightening when he saw her. "Your ankle must be much improved," he commented as their horses fell into step beside each other. "Dr. Simmons says I'm making a remarkable recovery," Willa replied, unable to keep the smile from her face, though he still cautions against galloping or jumping fences. "Wise advice," Jake said with mock seriousness, "though I suspect you'll be doing both before the week is out." They established a routine over the following days, meeting at dawn when few others were about to witness their rides together. Jake showed her hidden glades and secret paths through the hills surrounding San Andreas, places of unexpected beauty that most townsfolk never bothered to explore. Willa found herself increasingly drawn to him. Jake treated her neither as a fragile ornament nor as a prize to be won, but as a person of value and substance. He listened to her ideas, respected her opinions, and challenged her thinking in ways that made her see the world differently. One morning, they stopped to rest by a small waterfall that tumbled into a clear pool. The early autumn sunlight filtered through the trees, dappling the ground with shifting patterns of gold. Willa sat on a fallen log while Jake knelt to refill their canteens. "My father returns from Sacramento tomorrow," she said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Jake's hands stilled momentarily before continuing their task. "I suppose our morning rides will have to end then." "He can't keep me under lock and key forever," Willa said with more conviction than she felt. "I'm 24 years old, not a child." "In your father's eyes, you're his most valuable asset," Jake replied, rising to his feet. "A beautiful daughter from a respected family is currency in social circles." "I'm not for sale," Willa said hotly. Jake's expression softened as he sat beside her on the log. "No, you're not. You're the most genuinely free spirit I've ever met, Willa Armstrong. That's what worries me." "What do you mean?" He gestured toward the waterfall. "Nature can't be contained indefinitely. Try to dam a stream and it either finds another path or builds up enough pressure to break through. Your father wants to channel you into the life he's chosen, but your spirit is too strong for that." "And that worries you?" she asked, puzzled. "It worries me what might happen when that pressure becomes too much." Jake reached out and tucked a stray curl behind her ear, his touch sending a shiver through her. "I don't want to see you hurt, Willa." The tenderness in his voice made her breath catch. Without conscious thought, she leaned toward him, drawn by an invisible force as powerful as gravity. Jake hesitated, his eyes searching hers before closing the distance between them. His lips were soft against hers, the kiss gentle and questioning. Willa had been kissed before hasty, awkward encounters with the sons of her father's associates, but never like this. This was a conversation without words, an exploration, a promise. When they parted, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since I pulled you up from that canyon ledge." "Why didn't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I know what happens to people who reach for things beyond their station," he replied with a hint of bitterness. "And because you deserved better than to be taken advantage of after a traumatic experience." Willa placed her palm against his cheek, feeling the roughness of day-old stubble beneath her fingers. "I know my own mind, Jake Riley. And right now, my mind is telling me I want you to kiss me again." A smile curved his lips before he obliged, this kiss deeper and more certain than the first. Willa felt herself melting against him, her arms twining around his neck as his hands settled at her waist. The distant sound of voices broke them apart. Riders were approaching along the main trail, not close enough to have seen them, but a stark reminder of the world beyond their private sanctuary. "We should head back," Jake said reluctantly. The ride back was filled with stolen glances and unspoken promises. They parted at the edge of the Armstrong property, Jake watching until Willa was safely within sight of the house, before turning midnight toward his own ranch. Thomas Armstrong returned from Sacramento the following evening, bringing with him William Thornton, the son of his banking associate. Willa knew immediately what her father intended when he insisted she join them for dinner, wearing her finest dress. William was handsome enough, with carefully styled blonde hair and fashionable attire. He spoke at length about his education at Harvard and his future in his father's banking enterprise. But his eyes rarely met Willa's, focusing instead on the expensive artwork and furnishings of the Armstrong home, as though mentally cataloging their worth. "William will be staying in San Andreas for several weeks," her father announced over dessert. "I thought perhaps you might show him around town, Willa. Introduce him to some of your friends." "Of course, father," she replied automatically, though her heart rebelled at the thought. Later, when William had retired to the guest room, Thomas lingered in the parlor with Willa. "He would make an excellent match," he said without preamble. "The Thornton Bank in San Francisco and our bank here could merge. The possibilities are tremendous." "Is that all that matters to you, father? Business possibilities?" Willa asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Thomas frowned. "Don't be naive, Willa. Marriage has always been about forming advantageous alliances. Your mother understood that, did she? Did she marry you for your prospects, father, or because she loved you?" A shadow crossed Thomas's face. "It was both. I was fortunate." His expression hardened. "But I won't leave your future to fortune. William is a good man from an excellent family. He can provide for you in the manner you deserve." "And if I want something different?" Willa challenged. "Such as?" her father asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Willa hesitated, knowing she was on treacherous ground. "To marry for love, to choose my own path." Thomas's laugh was without humor. "And what path would that be? Running wild in the hills, or perhaps spending time with inappropriate companions?" At Willa's startled expression, he added, "Did you think I wouldn't hear about your morning rides with Riley? San Andreas is a small town, Willa. There are no secrets here." "Jake saved my life," she reminded him, "and I paid him for his service," Thomas countered. "Whatever misguided gratitude you feel for that man ends now. You are the daughter of Thomas Armstrong, not some common ranch girl to be courted by a cowboy with a questionable family history." Willa felt tears of frustration burn behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. "Jake is a good man. He's built something from nothing, despite the obstacles placed in his way some by you, from what I understand." Thomas's face darkened with anger. "You know nothing about that situation. Riley was reaching above his station, trying to court the judge's daughter. I merely helped Harrington see the unsuitability of the match. By calling in his loan, by nearly ruining him," Willa demanded. "That was cruel, father. It was necessary, just as this conversation is necessary." Thomas's tone brooked no argument. "You will not see Riley again. You will focus on William Thornton and the future that awaits you. This is not a request, Willa." With that, he left her alone in the parlor, the weight of his expectations pressing down like chains. Over the next week, Willa dutifully accompanied William on rides through town, to church services, and to dinner at the homes of San Andreas' prominent citizens. He was unfailingly polite, if somewhat condescending in his manner. It became clear that he viewed their arranged courtship as a business transaction, one that would benefit him with both Willa's dowry and the merger of their family's banks. She saw Jake only once during this time, across the crowded Main Street as she left the dressmaker's shop with William. Their eyes met briefly, and the flash of pain in Jake's expression before he turned away cut her to the quick. That night, Willa made her decision. She waited until the house was quiet, then wrote a letter to her father explaining her feelings. She packed a small valise with essential items, and her mother's locket, the one possession she could not bear to leave behind. Then, with practiced silence from years of sneaking out to ride, she made her way to the stables. Penny nickered softly as Willa saddled her. "We're going on an adventure, girl," she whispered, leading the horse out into the moonlit night. The ride to North Ridge Ranch seemed both endless and over too quickly. Lights still burned in Jake's windows despite the late hour. Willa hesitated at the edge of the yard, suddenly uncertain. What if he turned her away? What if he didn't feel for her what she had come to feel for him? Before she could lose her nerve, Jake appeared in the doorway, a rifle in his hands. When he recognized her, he lowered the weapon immediately. "Willa," he called, setting the rifle aside and striding toward her. "What are you doing here? Is something wrong?" She slid from Penny's back, her legs unsteady beneath her. "Everything's wrong, Jake. My father wants me to marry William Thornton. He's forbidden me from seeing you again." Jake's expression hardened. "So you've come to say goodbye?" "No," Willa said, stepping closer to him. "I've come to ask if you'll take me with you." Confusion replaced the anger in his eyes. "Take you with me where?" "Anywhere," she said with a conviction that surprised even her. "Away from San Andreas, away from my father's plans for my life. I don't want to be a banker's wife in a loveless marriage. I want—" She hesitated, then continued, her voice stronger. "I want a chance to discover what we might be together." Jake ran a hand through his hair, clearly conflicted. "Willa, do you understand what you're saying? What you'd be giving up? Your father would disown you. Society would shun you. The life you've known, the life I've known, has been a gilded cage," she interrupted. "I was never free to make my own choices, to follow my heart. Until you pulled me from that canyon, I was just going through the motions of living. You showed me there's more to life than what my father has planned for me." Jake stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "I can't offer you the comforts you're accustomed to. My ranch is small, the work is hard, and there are no guarantees." "I don't want guarantees," Willa said. "I want a chance at something real, something true." For a long moment, Jake searched her face in the moonlight. Then, with a gentleness that belied his strength, he drew her into his arms. "I've loved you since I found you on that ledge," he confessed. "Your courage, your spirit, everything about you calls to something in me I thought died long ago." "And I love you," Willa whispered against his chest, "enough to leave everything behind." Their lips met in a kiss that sealed their decision. When they parted, Jake pressed his forehead to hers. "If we're going to do this, we need to move quickly. Your father won't let you go without a fight." Inside the ranch house, they formulated a plan. They would leave before dawn, riding north to Placerville where Jake had friends who could help them. From there, they would head east to Nevada territory where land was plentiful, and a man was judged by his character rather than his family name. "We should be married before we go," Jake said as they gathered supplies. "I won't have anyone saying I stole you away dishonorably." Willa's heart swelled at his concern for her reputation, even as they planned to flee. Pastor Jenkins lives just outside town. "He's always been kind to me, and he stood up for your father at his trial, didn't he?" argued for leniency. Jake nodded, surprise in his expression. You know about that? I've learned a lot about you these past weeks, Willa said with a small smile. The town may have tried to forget the man who spoke for justice rather than vengeance, but some remember. By midnight, they had gathered their essential belongings and supplies for the journey. They rode to Pastor Jenkins' small house, where the elderly man answered their knock with remarkable calmness for someone roused in the dead of night. I wondered when you two would come to me, he said, ushering them inside. Word travels even to old men's ears. Under the soft glow of oil lamps, with the pastor's housekeeper as witness, Jake and Willa exchanged vows. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, their promises to one another made with clear eyes and full hearts. The road ahead won't be easy, Pastor Jenkins warned them as he signed the marriage certificate. Thomas Armstrong isn't a man who accepts defeat gracefully. We're prepared, Jake assured him, his arm around Willa's waist. They rode out of San Andreas as the first light of dawn broke over the eastern hills. Willa felt a momentary pang as they passed the town limits, leaving behind the only home she had ever known. But when she looked at Jake riding beside her, she knew she was heading toward home rather than away from it. Their journey north was uneventful at first. They kept to less traveled paths, camping at night under the stars. Jake taught Willa the skills she would need for their new life: how to build a fire, how to read animal tracks, how to shoot the small revolver he insisted she carry. She proved an apt pupil, her determination making up for her lack of experience. On the third day, as they approached a river crossing, Jake suddenly reined in midnight. "Riders," he said tersely, pointing to a dust cloud in the distance behind them. "At least 4 moving fast." Willa's heart sank. Father must have hired men to find us. Jake quickly surveyed their surroundings. "There's a stand of trees upstream. We can cross there and use the forest for cover." They urged their horses into the river, the cold water swirling around the animals' legs. The opposite bank was steeper than it had appeared, and the horses struggled to gain purchase on the slick mud. Just as they reached the tree line, shouts echoed across the water. "Riley! Stop right there!" 4 riders appeared on the opposite bank, their horses lathered from hard riding. Willa recognized Sheriff Davis among them, along with 2 of her father's ranch hands. The 4th was William Thornton himself, his fashionable clothes ill-suited for the chase. "Keep going," Jake urged, guiding Midnight deeper into the forest. "I'll hold them off." "No," Willa protested. "We stay together." The determination in her voice brooked no argument. Jake nodded, and they continued through the trees, using the dense forest to their advantage. Behind them, they could hear the splash of horses crossing the river. They emerged from the forest onto a rocky slope that offered little cover but would be difficult for horses to navigate quickly. "Up there," Jake pointed to a ridge where boulders provided natural shelter. "We can make a stand if necessary." They dismounted and led the horses up the slope, picking their way carefully over loose stones. When they reached the ridge, Jake positioned Willa behind the largest boulder before checking his rifle. "I won't shoot to kill," he assured her, seeing the concern in her eyes. "But I'll defend what's mine." The pursuers appeared at the forest edge, hesitating at the sight of the difficult terrain ahead. Sheriff Davis raised a speaking trumpet to his lips. "Riley, send Miss Armstrong down and we can end this peacefully. It's Mrs. Riley now." Willa called back before Jake could respond. "And I go where my husband goes." Even from a distance, she could see the shock on their faces. William Thornton's features contorted with rage, and he spurred his horse forward onto the slope despite the sheriff's warning shout. "You thieving bastard!" he yelled, drawing a pistol from his coat. "Armstrong will see you hang for this." Jake raised his rifle in warning. "Turn back, Thornton. This doesn't have to end badly." But William was beyond reasoning, his pride wounded more than his heart. He fired wildly, the shot going wide. Jake's return fire was more precise, striking the ground directly in front of William's horse. The animal reared in terror, throwing its inexperienced rider. William tumbled down the slope, landing in an undignified heap at the bottom. Sheriff Davis and the ranch hands hurried to assist him, finding him bruised and bloodied but largely unhurt. His pride, however, was shattered. As they helped him to his feet, Davis looked up at the ridge. "Riley," he called, "this isn't over." "Armstrong's offering $1,000 for his daughter's return." "Tell Armstrong his daughter is exactly where she wants to be," Willa shouted back. "And if he truly loves me, he'll respect my choice." The standoff continued for several tense minutes before Davis finally signaled retreat. They watched as the four riders disappeared back into the forest. William Thornton slumped in his saddle. "They'll be back with more men," Jake said, lowering his rifle. "We need to keep moving." They traveled north by day and east by night, avoiding main roads and settlements where word might have spread. By the time they crossed into Nevada territory a week later, there was no sign of pursuit. The landscape changed around them, harsher, more open, but with a raw beauty that spoke to Willa's spirit. They found a small community near the Sierra Nevada foothills, where silver mining had created opportunity, but not yet the rigid social structures of more established towns. With the money Jake had saved and what Willa had brought from her inheritance from her mother, they purchased land with good water and grazing potential. The cabin was little more than a shack at first, but they worked side by side to improve it, adding rooms as their needs grew. Word eventually reached them that Thomas Armstrong had publicly disowned his daughter, declaring her dead to him. The news hurt Willa deeply, but Jake's love and the community they were building around them helped heal the wound. 3 years after their flight from San Andreas, on a crisp autumn morning much like the day Jake had rescued her from Eagle Canyon, Willa placed their newborn son in his father's arms. "He has your eyes," Jake said, wonder in his voice as he cradled the tiny bundle. "What shall we call him?" Willa leaned against her husband's shoulder, watching their son's small face. "Thomas," she said after a moment, "for my father. Despite everything, I want our son to know where he comes from." Jake kissed her forehead. "Thomas Riley it is then, a bridge between two worlds." 6 months later, a letter arrived bearing the San Andreas postmark. Jake brought it to Willa with trepidation, recognizing Thomas Armstrong's handwriting. She read it in silence, tears gathering in her eyes. "Father is ill," she said finally. "The doctor doesn't expect him to recover. He wants to see us to meet his grandson before it's too late." The journey back to San Andreas was tense with anticipation. The town had changed little in their absence, though Willa noted new buildings along the main street and unfamiliar faces among the townsfolk who stared at their return. The Armstrong house on the hill seemed smaller than she remembered, its grandeur diminished by the perspective she'd gained. Mrs. Tillman met them at the door, her face lighting up at the sight of the baby in Willa's arms. "He's been waiting for you," the housekeeper said, leading them upstairs to Thomas's bedroom. The man in the bed was a shadow of the powerful banker who had once ruled Willa's life. Illness had thinned his face and whitened his hair, making him appear far older than his 58 years. "Willa," he breathed, extending a trembling hand. "You came." She sat beside him, adjusting young Thomas in her arms so her father could see his face. "This is your grandson, Father, Thomas Riley." The old man's eyes filled with tears as he reached out to touch the baby's cheek. "He's beautiful." His gaze shifted to Jake, who stood respectfully at the foot of the bed. "Riley," Jake nodded. "Mr. Armstrong, "You've taken care of her?" Thomas asked, his voice weak but insistent. "We've taken care of each other," Jake replied. "Your daughter is the strongest person I know." A hint of the old Thomas Armstrong emerged in his proud smile. "She gets that from her mother." He turned back to Willa. "I was wrong, daughter, about many things. Can you forgive an old fool who thought he knew best?" Willa took his hand, feeling the fragile bones beneath paper-thin skin. "I forgave you long ago, Father." They stayed in San Andreas for 2 weeks, during which Thomas Armstrong made his peace with both his daughter and the son-in-law he had once despised. He held his grandson daily, telling the infant stories of his grandmother and the early days of San Andreas. When Thomas passed, he did so with his family around him, his hand in Willa's, his grandson sleeping peacefully in Jake's arms. The will, read 3 days later, contained surprises for everyone. Thomas had left the bank to his senior manager, with provisions that Jake and Willa would receive a portion of the profits annually. The Armstrong house and half his fortune went to Willa, with the other half placed in trust for young Thomas. Most surprising was the deed to 500 acres adjoining Jake's original property in Nevada, purchased secretly by Thomas in the months before his death. He wanted to build a bridge, the lawyer explained, using the same words Willa had spoken to Jake when naming their son. They returned to Nevada with mixed emotions but a renewed sense of purpose. The land Thomas had left them allowed them to expand their ranch significantly, creating one of the most prosperous operations in the territory. They built a new home, larger but still maintaining the simplicity they both valued, with a wide porch that faced the mountains. Over the years, their family grew. A daughter joined them 2 years after young Thomas, followed by twin boys 3 years later. Each spring, they would make the journey to San Andreas to place flowers on Thomas Armstrong's grave and visit with old friends. On one such visit, 10 years after their flight from San Andreas, they rode out to Eagle Canyon. The path seemed less treacherous than Willa remembered, the drop less sheer, though the beauty of the red sandstone walls remained unchanged. "It's strange," she said as they stood at the spot where Penny had thrown her so long ago. "If I hadn't fallen here, if you hadn't found me." Jake pulled her close, his arms as strong and sure as they had been the day he carried her up from that ledge. "I would have found you somehow," he said with quiet certainty. "Some things are meant to be." Willa looked out over the canyon, then back at the man who had changed her life with an act of courage and kindness. "I believe you're right," she said, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "Some things are meant to be." They rode home together as the sun set behind them, casting long shadows across the land. They had come to love a land as wide and free as the future they had built together.